Um, this is my presentation on the overview of membrane transportation. I thought it would be appropriate to appreciate this little cartoon figure over here that illustrates a cell's membrane. And now that I understand the functions of cell membranes, it really allows me to appreciate its anatomy. And that being said, cell membrane transportation is crucial for life as we know it. Therefore, we must appreciate its processes. I wanted to begin my presentation by discussing passive transport. Then I wanted to discuss active transport. Then I wanted to give a brief comparison between active and passive transport, compare and contrast them. Then I wanted to compare and contrast facilitated diffusion and simple diffusion. Then I was going to give you a real life example of secondary active transport. And finally, I wanted to illustrate or discuss the importance of charge across the membrane. Now, passive transport is the diffusion of a substance across a cell's membrane. And this occurs without other outside forces at work. And substances will generally move or diffuse from a more concentrated environment to a less concentrated environment. And a good thing to note is that no work is performed for this to occur, as diffusion is a spontaneous process. However, although the process is spontaneous, the rate of diffusion for different substances is affected by the membrane's permeability. That being said, we know that the cell membranes are selectively permeable or only allows for certain substances to enter or exit. And we can appreciate the fact that different molecules have different rates of diffusion. For example, water diffuses freely across membranes, which I guess makes sense because water is crucial to many cellular processes. Others, however, need assistance from special transport proteins, as we see here, a process called facilitated diffusion. And osmosis, on the other hand, is a special case of passive transport which allows water to freely diffuse across a membrane through a protein channel called aquaporin. Active transport, on the other hand, is much more different than that of passive transport. And one reason being is that it results in the accumulation of solute beyond equilibrium, and it is thermodynamically unfavorable and driven by ATP hydrolysis. So, another thing to note is that active transport materials or molecules move from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration by transporter proteins, and the cell must use energy or ATP. So there are two types of active transport: the primary active transport, which directly uses ATP to transport molecules, and the secondary active transport, which uses a gradient to co-transport solutes, which is set up by primary active transport processes. So the secondary active transport depends solely on that electrochemical gradient created by the primary active transport. And a good example of this is the sodium potassium pump. As we see here, the ATP driven sodium potassium pump stores energy by creating a steep concentration gradient for sodium entry into the cell. And as sodium diffuses back across the cell, across the membrane through a membrane co-transporter protein, it drives glucose against its concentration gradient into the cell. Also, this cartoon figure over here really helps illustrate step by step the processes that primary active transporters go through, essentially. Now that I discussed a little bit about passive and active transport, I just wanted to briefly compare and contrast the two again. As I've mentioned, passive transport is spontaneous and does not ultimately require any energy, whereas active transport requires ATP or the use of energy. Passive transports move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, whereas active transports usually go against the concentration gradient. So this is why passive transports are energetically favorable. Passive transports include simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis, whereas active transports include primary and secondary active transports. So again, these cartoons over here illustrate the use of the ATP or energy use in active transports and illustrates the different processes passive transporters use to carry out their functions. So you have channeled proteins and which are ultimately facilitated diffusion and or carrier proteins, and you have your simple diffusion.